Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome back to the Cloudcast. We are coming to you live from the massive Cloudcast studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. Hope everybody is doing well. Super Bowl Sunday, at least for those of you listening on Sunday. If you're listening afterwards, Super Bowl is already done. And for those of us that football is just a part of our DNA, a part of what we do. We will be moving into about a 6-month era, a 6-month period of having to deal with the malaise of no football in our life. So anyways, enjoy the last day of football, at least from an American football perspective. I hope everybody's doing well. February is here. The weather is now in the full on, on any given day, it could be beautiful, it could be miserable, or it could be anywhere in between, which is sort of February. I think that's the reason, way back in the day, the weather gods and the calendar gods decided that February only needs 28 days, right? We only need 28 days of this really weird in-between sort of weather. So anyways, hope everybody's doing well. Today's an interesting show. And again, in the sort of Cote, how the heck do you come up with stuff things? I was reading an article by a gentleman, by the name of David Linthicum, who is a friend of the show, somebody we've known around the industry for a long, long time. David is kind of one of the original people that was really covering cloud from a media and analyst perspective. He's been at different places. But he wrote an interesting article that was called Public Cloud Providers Are Missing the Mark with AI. And he kind of dove into, kind of the challenges that the cloud providers are now having in terms of, when they were building the cloud, we all sort of were in awe of these amazing things that they were building in terms of, building facilities, building new cloud services. But so many of them were very much IT services, right? Things that your IT organization could have built using CPU-based resources for the most part, right? And yeah, there's going to be nuances in between. But I mean, compute, storage, networking, databases, queuing systems, firewalls, all that sort of stuff. Those were things that they built in a very new way, right? On demand, scalable in ways that we'd never really seen before. But again, all of them were, for the most part, built on top of CPU-based systems, right? And they were networked in certain ways that, were essentially extensions of what we'd seen in the data center. And what he sort of highlights is we're now into an era in which they have to make a decision of, the AI world doesn't necessarily just easily overlay on top of, existing kind of, data center CPU-based systems, whether it's, it's how they're networked, whether it's, the performance they need for storage, whether it's, the GPUs themselves, all the things in between. He sort of points out that we're now sort of at an inflection point where so much money is being placed, it's being spent, is being allocated for these new projects, right? We've got, Microsoft saying they're going to spend $80 billion this year. I think Alphabet and Google said 65 to 70 billion. Amazon saying somewhere north of 75 billion. So, tons of money is being spent on these things. And his point to the whole article was really, this is an inflection point for them, because this is not just add another service, add another capability. This is really figure out how do you deal with kind of two different architectures, right? The architecture that is very CPU based and, things that we've known for a long time, we've figured out how to scale over the last decade. And this new world in which, if the thing that you're trying to achieve is, either performance or, cost efficiency or whatever, because again, now with the GPU world, we don't live in a world in which compute is essentially free, right? In the way that people talk about things being free. And so that got me sort of thinking that, we're really kind of coming full circle. And for those of you that listen to the show for a long time, you'll know what I mean by this. But, in essence, we are now entering the Bi-Modal Cloud era, right? And what I mean by that is, for reference, about 10 years ago, Gartner, so for reference, when the world sort of came around to this idea that, whether it was software is eating the world or we can completely change the experience that a business can deliver to their customers through things like software, mobile devices, all sorts of things, right? The world went from being sort of a mix of digital and analog to the idea of sort of digital transformation. Like, what can we do to completely rethink our business, change our business, in ways that software and sort of digital experiences are front and center to what that is, right? Those are really defining for what the world looks like for many companies. We got into, all sorts of everything that was sort of fell on digital transformation. And Gartner, who, analyst firm who, works with lots and lots of enterprises, I think was probably fundamentally dealing with the challenge of businesses calling up and saying, hey, all that stuff that they talked about at that conference, whether it was an Adrian Cockcroft talk or it was a KubeCon or it was a whatever it is, that stuff is all cool. And it's got all these people in my organization really excited about this stuff. But we still have, 80, 70, 80, 90% of what we do and where we spend our money is still on quote unquote legacy things. And now sometimes they're called heritage things, or they're called, I've heard them called legendary things recently, whatever it is, right? Old stuff, right? Older stuff, but it maintains the business, and everything from, mainframes to CRMs to, supply chain things to just your email system to whatever it is, right? It's not the new cloud native. It doesn't have to scale automatically. It's not just a mobile application. And so Gartner at the time, being like anybody else, wanted to market an idea, wanted to create an idea, came up with the idea of something they called Bi-Modal IT. And the basic idea behind Bi-Modal IT, and I'll try and put some links in the show notes because I think we've probably talked about it, 100 times or whatever, sometimes in seriousness and sometimes joking, was the idea that the teams and the technology you use to do the older stuff, the legacy stuff, the heritage stuff, you're not going to be able to do that same thing with, the new modern systems. They're just so different. You need different skill sets. You need different processes. It's going to be hard for anybody who's been, doing something for 20 plus years to be able to adjust their skill set to fit into this new world. And so they created this idea of sort of bimodal, right? And the idea was sort of, fast and slow, old and new, whatever, however you wanted to sort of talk about it. But it was basically like there needs to be a distinct split because you can't manage these two things together. And this created a lot of sort of turmoil and discussion within our industry because there was, depending on who was having the conversation, you may have, there was a lot of, well, I don't want to be considered old. I don't want to be considered slow, right? So there was a lot of like, well, you could take the existing systems and do modern stuff on top of it, right? So you had people talking about doing, GitOps and DevOps on the mainframe, or you heard people talking about, well, this legacy system with this bolt-on thing could be adapted to play in this new world, whatever it might be, right? There was a lot of, I don't want to be perceived as the old because, we know what that means in our industry. Now, the other thing that it kind of brought along, and I'm going to get to the point for those either to like, hey, stop with the history lesson. It also brought up this interesting conversation, which was, okay, you can classify stuff as old or slow or whatever you want, but do keep in mind that those systems, not only have been extremely valuable for the company for long, long periods of time. They power the majority of the things that drive revenue for businesses. But number two, they're not going away anytime, right? They still process transactions. They still manage customer relationships. They still do all these sort of things. And so there was sort of the second backlash, which was, well, why is so much attention being paid to these new things? Why is so much budget being allocated to these new things when they have, in very few cases, proven that A, they're going to be capable of what we need, but number two, those new ideas haven't really proven that they're going to be profitable yet, that they're going to actually generate revenue. And so, you sort of went from the, new and shiny being like, hey, look at me, look at all the cool things we can do. We can deploy 10 times a day, whatever it might be, to being like the sort of old and, old and stable being like, yeah, but you don't make any money. Right. So that was the gist of Bi-Modal. It was, this kind of putting a wedge between, broad systems and trying to segment them in a way that was like, hey, the two of you can't really coexist. And then once that wedge was sort of put in place, the two different sides of it kind of arguing for their supremacy, and then people trying to justify, why one should be funded versus the other or whatever it might be. And I bring all that up because as I was reading David's piece, it really sort of dawned on me. So I was reading David's piece and then subsequently over the last week or so, we've seen the earnings come out from Microsoft and Alphabet and Amazon, and all three of them, at least from an analyst perspective, right? An analyst, forecast perspective, all three of them missed their cloud earnings number. Now, some of them, Microsoft and Alphabet missed a little bit more. Amazon was sort of right on the number, but it was, maybe just a hair under. So we're still going to give Matt Garman, a gold star for sort of his first or second kind of go around on this. But it was the first time we've seen all three of them. And it, this may be a total fluke. It might be beginning of a trend. We don't know yet. But it was really the first time we've seen all three of them not make their forecast. Right now, just for clarification, all three of the cloud providers still continue to grow, right? I think Amazon was in the 12 or 13% year-over-year growth. Microsoft was in the 30-ish% year-over-year growth. And Alphabet was in the 40% year-over-year growth. And again, those numbers are growth off of, previous numbers. So, Amazon's not growing as fast, but they're growing on top of a bigger number, blah, blah, blah. We've talked about that a million times. But it was interesting because as they were trying to explain this, because again, keep in mind, at least for Amazon and to a certain extent Microsoft, the cloud revenue is, one of the biggest cash cows for the business, right? It's very, very important for Google, less so because still, search is the the cash cow, and YouTube is still makes a ton of money and all those sort of things. And but they sort of, people were asking, well, what happened? Right. And to a certain extent, anytime you miss or you just barely make the number, the first thing that oftentimes happens is well, the analysts were wrong, right? We can only run our business. We can't necessarily dictate what the analysts do. And that's fine. But also at the same time, when they blow out their numbers, the analysts are never wrong. The analysts didn't understand how great their business was. So let's put all that aside. It was interesting because almost every one of them, and I think every one of them to a certain extent, kind of highlighted that they're trying to figure out this transition from, the cloud business, which has become, very cash cow centric, very steady run rate. They continue to grow. They know how to scale it, all the CPU based stuff, to they're now trying to figure out how do they monetize, not only how do they monetize the AI piece of it while making these huge investments, which is its own challenge. We've talked about it on the show. We'll probably continue to talk about it. But how do they balance that with, everything that goes along with running, selling, monetizing the cloud business, right? And I think this is the most interesting kind of inflection point is we're now a decade in. And like I said, for a decade, while they've added 1 million services on top of their clouds, all of those have, for the most part, been CPU-based services. They could build them. They could build the networks around them. They could build the security models around them. They could, dictate what the compute looked like, to the CPU providers. And now they're in a very different mode, right? They're in a mode in which they are having to spend wildly ahead of revenue. They're having to architect them in far different ways, right? And we've heard, everybody from AWS to Jensen Huang to all sorts of folks talk about how, you have to build these GPU centric architectures very differently in terms of storage and networking and latency and power and cooling and all this sort of stuff. And it's been 10 years that we're really kind of coming around to this. And so it got me thinking about what are the things that are going on, and how do we think about this? So the first thing that came to mind was, yes, we've come around 10 years on this thing. But it also got me thinking, and we've been kind of going through this for the last probably year plus here on the Cloudcast, because you notice that while the show is still called the Cloudcast, the way that we describe the show is, kind of the intersection of cloud and AI, because that's the reality of what our world has become, right? We're still covering the cloud as much as we can. There are still interesting things happening in the cloud, but AI has become such a big deal that we kind of have to find the balance between them. And the first thing that sort of dawned on me as they missed their numbers, and I know this is sort of weird and backwards type of thinking, but it got me thinking, is the cloud now interesting again? And I mean that not in the context of the technology, but I mean that in the context of we're now into a new phase in which you have to think about what the cloud does, the three big cloud businesses or four big cloud businesses, whatever they might be, the hyperscalers, in terms of understanding their business, right? Because they're now going through the thing that every IT organization essentially went through 10 plus years ago, that created their reasoning to begin with, right? The fast part of Bi-Modal was the part that the existing IT organizations couldn't service themselves, and hence became the rise of cloud. So the cloud providers are now sort of going through that same, fork in the road conundrum of how do I service both, a chat GPT segment of the market and the rest of the market, which again, very, very difficult to do, right? So it did get me thinking, like, is cloud interesting again, but maybe not in the way that a lot of the folks who listen to the show from a technologist perspective might think about it, but in terms of, for the folks that listen to the show, in terms of, how do you manage a business that has, very different, speeds, paths, if you will, and what are the ramifications of that in terms of these gigantic companies that are so dependent on their cloud business being a cash cow, being, a profitable cow, and so forth. So that was the first thing that jumped to mind. And as I sort of walked through it, it was, the thoughts that went through my head were a couple of them, right? How do the clouds make all this CapEx spending work, given their other segment of the business, right? So the other segment of the business, I don't say segment of the business, I mean, they've been making 80+% margins on the cloud business for a long time. And the GPU part of the business isn't going to necessarily do that anytime soon. Now, anytime soon could be 2 years from now, it could be 3 or 4 years from now, who knows? And again, maybe the DeepSeek stuff blows it all up. We don't know. We're all learning a little bit more about DeepSeek. Maybe it's not as super efficient as the early headlines were. But that's really important. I guess the second piece of it is the cash cow that was the cloud, that is still the cloud, is it still the cash cow? Is it still the cash cow? Right. And I think this is something that a lot of people are sort of asking themselves, because Amazon is no longer just a retailer, and Microsoft is no longer just, the company that sells, desktop PC stuff and server side stuff and so forth. And even Google, right? Like, how much can you continue to use the spending that you're doing for technology that's useful for ads, and then sort of extend that down into what you do in the cloud? Like, is that still something that's easy to do, right? Can the spend for, the ad side of the business still sort of just cover and extend the technology and the spend that'll be viable in the cloud part of the business, right? I think those things are fantastically interesting. The other part that I think is going to be really interesting is kind of how do the teams internal to the clouds start to react to this? And I say this for anybody who has worked for a vendor company, or really any company who sells products as opposed to just services. There's going to be a point in time in which the thing you're working on is going to be the new hot thing, right? It's going to be the new exciting thing. And then at some point, the thing you're working on, if you've been doing it for a while, your company is likely going to get into other areas, and those become the new hot thing. And it'll be very interesting to figure out, what happens within an Amazon, what happens within a Google, what happens within Microsoft when, let's say you were working on, I don't know, the developer project. You could be working on the S3 stuff at Amazon, sort of the crown jewels of, EC2 and S3. And now all of a sudden you're looking at your budget for the year, you're looking at your priority for the year, and you're like, the company is going to spend $75+ billion. And Andy Jassy is going to come out and talk for 30+ minutes about stuff that isn't EC2 and S3, right? Like, how does that culturally kind of reverberate through the business? And I know that from having worked in companies where the stuff I was working on was sort of the new hotness. And other times it was, kind of the old and boring. And again, we went through the exact same things that the sort of Bi-Modal IT thing went through, which was, hold on a second, we're making tens of billions of dollars. We're making hundreds of millions of dollars, whatever that might be. And we're highly profitable. And this other group is getting 50 times the marketing spend and all the new headcount for stuff that hasn't proven itself out yet. And there's a deep psychological thing that goes on between those teams in which you're just sort of like, wait, why is this happening? Like, why? Because it's difficult to quantify. It's easy to quantify the idea of, are we profitable? Did we make our number? Right? Those are very easy to quantify things. We had a number to make, and did we make that number? And then how efficient were we at making that number? Like, how profitable were we? But it's very difficult to sort of quantify and justify the idea of, okay, there's this other part of the business and it's not yet profitable, and that's fine, but it's potentially interesting business. It's potentially, a growth business at some point in the future. But the question you have for yourself is, how far in advance do we spend, right? Like, how much in advance do we spend? And that's a very difficult thing to quantify. And I'm sure people will argue, well, you can build spreadsheets and, future cash flows and discounted cash flows. And what's your, like, you can do this sort of, classic thing. But most people don't think that way. They just simply think of like, well, this is our budget. That's their budget. And to communicate that as an executive team is sort of difficult, because to a certain extent, you tend to communicate like parents do, like, oh, I love all my kids the same way. But at the same time, your budget communicates exactly where you think the priority should be. And it communicates exactly what you think are growth areas, or you hope to be growth areas, right? And so I think that's going to be very interesting to sort of watch, especially when we've gone from 10 years of the teams that have built these things, and people talking about them being rock stars and all this sort of stuff. It takes a toll on teams. The other thing I think is going to be very interesting to watch is, and we kind of talked about Stargate a week or two ago. I forget when it was. Things are moving fast. The Stargate project, the one in which, there's going to be this huge $500 billion, AI data center that gets created somewhere in Texas or wherever it ends up getting created and distributed and so forth. But it did get me thinking, if Bi-Modal IT essentially was kind of the impetus or the realization of why the cloud actually happened, which was, your internal organizations aren't able to keep up with the pace of something that seems to be moving very fast, right? i.e. the cloud native part of what people wanted to do with digital transformation. Does that same sort of thing happen here, in which now the cloud providers have sort of Bi-Modal Cloud, right? They're having to deal with sort of legacy cloud stuff and AI stuff, which, as we talked about, are two difficult things to manage in parallel because they are very different. Stargate is, maybe the Death Star size version of this, but like, do we begin to see a new iteration emerge? Not necessarily a core weave, or maybe it's a core weave or any of the variations that look like core weave, but do we start to see, a iteration of cloud that just looks like it's focused on AI and building AI applications, right? I think that's going to be an interesting thing to watch, because I think for many of us, your thought was, well, the 3 big clouds or 4 big clouds or whatever have sort of established themselves as the place where all the new technology is going to go. But if we start to see the idea that, like, managing the mix that they now have to manage between, heritage cloud and new, shiny, sexy AI is becoming more difficult. And again, we'll have to watch more data points as earnings come out for the new quarters coming out. Do we start to see a new type of sort of AI plus AI application cloud emerge the same way that like Amazon emerged, right? I think that'll be very interesting to watch. It would be very, very interesting to watch, for example, for all of the AI applications that Andy Jassy talked about Amazon doing, or I'm sure, Google could talk about, all the AI applications they use to, do cool new things for Google services, not just the Google Cloud stuff. Are they frustrated now with having to work with Amazon Web Services, right? Are they frustrated that like some aspect of the cloud networking architecture that's sort of being pushed over on the AI side of things, is that slowing them down? Do they wish they could go outside of things, right? Do the teams that have access to the biggest clouds wish they had shadow IT or shadow cloud? And I think that's going to be very interesting to watch. And again, given the size that they have, maybe it's not going to be a big deal. Maybe they'll figure it out and sort it out and so forth. But the parallels to what we went through with, digital transformation within enterprises, IT organizations trying to keep up, but having to realize also that they've got, 80, 90% of what they do has to remain how it is. They want to keep the lights on. It makes money for them. It's profitable, all that kind of stuff. It does feel like we're now seeing a little bit of that parallel in the cloud providers. And it makes total sense because the cloud providers essentially in many cases have become, sort of your newer IT, or at least they're the new part of your IT. And nothing stays the same. Everything is, I don't want to say under threat, but everything changes, and your ability to do two things at once, three things at once, especially when those two or three things are very different in lots of structural ways and lots of system ways and lots of economic ways, is very, very difficult. So anyways, I thank David for writing his original article. It got me thinking. It helped kind of motivate what we're going to talk about this week. But I think it's going to be very interesting to watch. And it'll take several quarters to sort of play out. But I think it'll be a very interesting sort of trend to watch, and what the downstream ramifications happen if this idea of Bi-Modal Cloud spins out anything like what we saw with public cloud, because Bi-Modal IT was struggling to go through that transition. So anyways, hope everybody gets their Super Bowl picks right. If you're listening to this on Sunday, hopefully your team won, or your team, your enemy's team lost, or whatever it might be. If you're listening to this on Monday or afterwards, if we need to do a football, kind of, help everybody get over not having football for 6 months, we'd be happy to do that and get Brandon back on. We can talk about that a little bit. But anyways, other than football stuff, hope everybody's doing well. Hope your Bi-Modal Cloud, your Bi-Modal AI, your Bi-Modal IT stuff are going well, that you're going through that. If you have questions, or actually if you've got stories about how you're managing that transition, we'd love to hear it. I think there's going to be a lot of interesting sort of transitional stories or things running in parallel. So again, hit us up, show@thecloudcast.net. You can do it that way, any of the social media ways, or any of the other ways that you all know how to reach us. So with that, I'll wrap it up. Thank you all for listening. Hope you're doing well, and we'll talk to you next week.
Thank you for listening to The Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.